Rain pelted against the metal roof of the livestock pavilion on New Haven, creating a steady drumming that mixed with the sounds of nervous animals and chattering buyers. Kira pressed herself against the back corner of her transport cage, her scaled hide trembling as auction workers moved around the staging area with electric prods and data tablets. Her fourth auction in 2 years. Each time the same routine, the same disappointed faces when buyers realized what they were getting. The thornback female had grown used to the whispers and headshakes from potential owners, who saw her medical records and quickly moved on to more promising specimens through the bars of her cage. She could see other creatures being prepared for sale. Young breeding pairs of various species, exotic farm animals from distant worlds, and specialized livestock bred for maximum profit. Unlike them, Kira had no impressive bloodline documentation, no fertility certificates, no guarantee of return on investment. A rough voice called out from the main auction floor, announcing the next lot numbers. Kira's number was approaching fast and her stomach churned with familiar dread. She had learned enough of the common trade language over the years to understand when auctioneers described her as problematic, unproductive, or suitable for research purposes only. The heavy footsteps of Broker Vance echoed through the staging area as he approached her cage, checking his tablet one more time. This human had been her handler for the past 6 months, keeping her in a sterile facility while trying to find someone willing to take a chance on damaged goods. Time to go. Worthless, he muttered, activating the cage's release mechanism. Try not to embarrass me more than you already have. Kira stumbled forward as the cage tilted, forcing her onto the loading platform that would carry her to the auction block. The bright lights of the main pavilion hurt her eyes after months in dimly lit holding pens. Hundreds of potential buyers filled the tiered seating, their alien faces showing various degrees of interest and calculation. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the space as Kira was positioned on the rotating display platform. Lot number 479, adult female thornback, approximately 8, standard years old. Previous breeding attempts unsuccessful but still within reproductive age range. A few hands went up half-heartedly in the crowd, but Kira had been through this enough times to recognize the pattern. These were curiosity bids, not serious offers. The price started low and climbed slowly as buyers tested the waters without real commitment. Previous owners report excellent. Health otherwise, the auctioneer continued, trying to generate more interest. Thornbacks are known for their longevity and adaptability to various climates, could serve well in research applications or as a companion animal. The bidding stalled at a pathetically low amount, barely covering the cost of transportation and housing. Kira felt the familiar weight of rejection settling over her like a heavy blanket. Soon she would be back in another sterile facility, waiting for the next auction or worse. From somewhere in the middle section of the pavilion, a new voice called out a bid that was only slightly higher than the current offer. The auctioneer perked up with renewed enthusiasm, though Kira could tell this was likely just another curious bidder who would lose interest quickly. The human who had placed the bid looked different from the usual buyers. His clothes were simple work gear rather than the expensive outfits worn by commercial breeders, and his weather-beaten hands suggested someone who actually worked with animals rather than just trading them. David Wells sat forward in his seat, studying Kira with an expression she had rarely seen directed toward her, something that might have been compassion. 2 more bidders entered the competition briefly, driving the price up just enough to make the auction interesting, but they dropped out when David continued to match their offers. The auctioneer worked hard to extract a few more credits from the situation, but eventually had to accept that this modest farmer was the only serious buyer in the room. Sold to bidder 217 for 800 credits, the auctioneer announced with barely concealed disappointment as the platform rotated to move. Kira toward the exit. She caught sight of David making his way through the crowd toward the payment station. Unlike other buyers she had observed, he did not look triumphant or calculating. Instead, his expression seemed almost apologetic, as if he understood that she deserved better than this whole degrading process. The next few hours passed in a blur of paperwork and transportation arrangements. Kira found herself loaded into yet another transport vehicle, this time a converted cargo hauler that smelled of hay and honest farm work, rather than the sterile chemical cleaners used in breeding. Facilities. David climbed into the driver's seat and glanced back at her through the partition. I know this probably feels familiar, he said quietly, but I promise things are going to be different this time. Kira did not understand all the words, but something in his tone was unlike anything she had heard from previous owners. There was no excitement about profit potential, no discussion of breeding schedules or productivity metrics, just a simple acknowledgement that she was a living being who had been through difficult experiences. The journey to David's farm took most of the remaining daylight hours. During the ride, Kira observed the landscape changing from industrial complexes and commercial breeding facilities to smaller homesteads and natural wilderness. The air coming through the transport's ventilation system gradually became cleaner and carried the sense of growing things rather than processed feeds and medical chemicals. When they finally arrived at David's property, Kira was surprised by how small and modest everything appeared. The main farmhouse was clearly old but well-maintained, surrounded by various outbuildings and fenced pastures, where she could see other animals moving freely. This was not the sterile efficiency of a commercial operation, but rather the controlled chaos of a working family farm. David parked near a barn that looked like it had been recently repaired, then came around to open Kira's transport cage. Instead of immediately attaching a lead rope or activating a control device, he simply stepped back and waited for her to emerge at her own pace. Take your time, he said, settling down on a nearby fence post. No rush, no schedules to keep, we have all the time you need. Kira cautiously stepped out onto solid ground, her legs stiff from the long journey. The evening air was sweet with the smell of growing crops and carried none of the harsh, chemical odors she had grown accustomed to. In the distance, she could hear other animals. Not the stressed sounds of overcrowded facilities, but the contented noises of creatures living in relative peace. For the first time in years, Kira felt something she had almost forgotten. A tiny spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, this place might be different from all the others. 3 weeks had passed since David brought Kira to his farm, and the morning routine had settled into something neither of them had expected. A comfortable partnership built on mutual respect rather than ownership. The first rays of sunlight streamed through the barn windows as David filled water troughs and checked on his various animals. Kira stood in the doorway of her stall, no longer the frightened creature who had arrived in a transport cage. Her scales had regained some of their natural luster, and her posture showed a confidence that had been missing for years. Unlike her previous accommodations, this stall opened directly onto a fenced pasture where she could graze freely throughout the day. Good morning, girl, David said as he approached, with her morning feed supplement. Though Kira did not understand the exact words, the warm tone and gentle approach had become familiar and comforting. She had learned to associate his presence with kindness rather than the clinical efficiency she had known before. David had quickly realized that treating Kira like livestock was not only wrong, but also completely ineffective. Instead of keeping her isolated in a breeding facility, he had given her the run of a 10-acre pasture that bordered on wild grasslands. The change in her behavior had been remarkable. Within days, she had begun exploring her surroundings with curiosity, rather than cowering in whatever corner felt safest. The other animals on the farm had accepted Kira's presence without the territorial disputes that David had initially worried about. His small herd of cattle seemed particularly fond of her company, often grazing nearby as if they recognized her as another herbivore despite her alien appearance. Even his border collie Rex had appointed himself as Kira's unofficial guardian, walking the fence line each morning to ensure her pasture remained secure. What surprised David most was discovering how intelligent Kira actually was. She had learned to operate the automatic water system in her pasture within hours of being introduced to it, and had figured out how to open the simple latch on her stall door when she wanted to move between indoor and outdoor areas. More importantly, she seemed to understand his daily routines and would often position herself to help with farm chores. On this particular morning, David noticed that Kira had arranged several fallen branches near the fence line in a way that would make his repair work easier. It was not the first time she had done something like this, and he was beginning to suspect that her helpfulness was more than coincidence. "You know what I am doing out here, do not you?" he asked, setting down his tools and studying her expression. Kira tilted her head slightly, a gesture that David had learned indicated attention and interest. Her large eyes seemed to focus on his face with an intensity that suggested she was processing more than just visual information, though neither of them understood it yet. Kira's limited telepathic abilities were beginning to pick up on David's emotional states and intentions. The breakthrough in their communication came during the 4th week, when a severe storm damaged several sections of fencing throughout the property. David had been working since dawn to assess the damage and plan repairs, feeling frustrated by the scope of the work and worried about the cost of materials. As he stood examining a particularly bad section of fence, David found himself talking aloud about his concerns. "I do not know how I am going to afford all these repairs," he muttered, running his hand through his hair. The last harvest barely covered the mortgage, and now this. Kira approached slowly, her usual caution replaced by what seemed like deliberate purpose. She moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her scaled hide. For several minutes they stood together looking at the damaged fence, and David gradually became aware that his anxiety was fading. It was then that he first suspected something extraordinary was happening. The feeling of calm that settled over him seemed to come from outside his own thoughts, as if someone else was offering reassurance and support. When he glanced at Kira, her eyes met his with an expression of understanding that seemed impossible for a non-sapient creature. "Can you understand me?" he asked quietly, feeling somewhat foolish for speaking to what everyone insisted was merely livestock. Kira's response was subtle but unmistakable. She moved closer and gently pressed her shoulder against his arm, a gesture of comfort that felt entirely deliberate. From that moment, David began treating their interactions as conversations rather than one-sided monologues over the following days. Their communication developed into something resembling a language of gestures and shared understanding. Kira would guide David to areas of the farm that needed attention, help move equipment to where it was needed, and even seemed to anticipate his needs before he recognized them himself. The changes in Kira's physical condition were becoming impossible to ignore. Her coat had developed a healthy sheen that highlighted the natural patterns in her scales. She had gained weight in all the right places, and her movement showed the fluid grace that characterized healthy thornbacks. Most remarkably, she had begun exhibiting behaviors that David's research indicated were associated with contentment and social bonding. David had spent hours reading everything he could find about thornback biology and behavior, learning that they were far more complex creatures than the agricultural industry generally recognized. They were social animals who formed strong emotional bonds with their herd. Mates possessed problem-solving abilities that rivaled some sapient species and required mental stimulation as much as physical care. The revelation that changed everything came when David discovered a research paper buried in an obscure xenobiology journal. The study suggested that thornbacks possessed limited telepathic abilities that were primarily emotional rather than cognitive. They could sense the feelings and intentions of other creatures, particularly those they had bonded with, and could project their own emotional states in return. The paper also contained a startling hypothesis about thornback reproduction, that their fertility was directly linked to their emotional well-being and sense of security. Stressed or unhappy, individuals would become physiologically incapable of reproduction, while those who felt safe and valued would regain full reproductive capacity. As David read this information, pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place. Kira's previous owners had all focused on physical health and genetic factors, while completely ignoring her emotional needs. They had kept her isolated, treated her as a commodity rather than a living being, and wondered why she failed to reproduce that evening. As David sat on his porch watching Kira graze peacefully in the pasture with his other animals, he realized that everything was about to change. If the research was correct, Kira was not barren at all. She had simply been waiting for someone to treat her with the respect and kindness that her species required for optimal health. The thought filled him with both excitement and responsibility. He had not bought Kira as an investment or breeding stock, but if she was indeed capable of reproduction, the implications would extend far beyond his small farm. More importantly, he would need to ensure that whatever happened next, it happened on Kira's terms rather than according to the demands of agricultural commerce. The discovery came on a humid morning in late summer, when David was checking the automatic feeding systems in the barn. Kira had been acting differently for several days, more protective of her sleeping area, eating with unusual enthusiasm, and spending longer periods resting in shaded areas. These behavioral changes might have gone unnoticed by her previous owners, but David had learned to pay attention to subtle shifts in her routine. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the local veterinarian who specialized in exotic species, arrived at the farm with her portable diagnostic equipment and a skeptical expression. She had dealt with David before and knew him to be a conscientious animal owner, but his request for a full reproductive health scan on a supposedly barren thornback seemed like a waste of time and credits. You understand this is probably going to show exactly what her previous medical records indicate, Dr. Martinez said as she unpacked her scanner. Thornback reproductive systems are fairly straightforward, and if multiple facilities have confirmed infertility, the chances of a different result are minimal. David nodded but remained hopeful as he guided Kira into the examination area he had prepared in the barn. The thornback female seemed unusually calm during the process, standing still while Dr. Martinez ran the scanner across her torso and checked various biological markers. The first indication that something unexpected was happening came when Dr. Martinez paused and frowned at her equipment display. She ran the scanner over the same area again, then checked her calibration settings before trying a third time. "That is strange," she muttered, adjusting the scanner's sensitivity. "I am getting readings that do not match her medical history." David felt his heart rate increase as Dr. Martinez continued her examination with growing intensity. The veterinarian's professional skepticism was gradually being replaced by scientific curiosity, as she documented readings that seemed to contradict everything they thought they knew about Kira's condition. "David," Dr. Martinez said slowly, her voice carrying a note of amazement, "I need to run some additional tests, but based on what I am seeing here, this animal is not only fertile, she appears to be carrying developing embryos." The words hung in the air between them like an impossible revelation. David stared at Kira, who seemed to understand that something significant was happening. Her large eyes met his with an expression that might have been pride mixed with nervousness. "How many?" David asked, barely able to process what he was hearing. Dr. Martinez continued her scan with methodical precision, documenting every detail as she mapped the developing life forms. 2 distinct embryos, both showing normal development patterns for their gestational stage. Based on size and cellular development, I would estimate she is approximately 10 weeks into what should be a 16-week pregnancy. The implications of this discovery began, cascading through David's mind like falling dominoes. Not only was Kira pregnant, but she was carrying twins, something that occurred in less than 5% of thornback pregnancies even under ideal conditions. This was not just a medical anomaly. It was a phenomenon that would revolutionize understanding of her entire species. "We need to contact the Agricultural Research Institute immediately," Dr. Martinez continued, her professional excitement overriding her usual caution. "This could represent a breakthrough in thornback husbandry that will be worth millions of credits in improved breeding programs." David felt a cold knot forming in his stomach as he realized what Dr. Martinez was suggesting. The moment word of Kira's pregnancy became public knowledge, she would become the most valuable piece of agricultural property on New Haven. Every major breeding corporation would want to acquire her, study her, and replicate whatever conditions had led to her successful conception. "What if we keep this information private for now?" David asked carefully. "At least until we understand more about what made this possible." Dr. Martinez looked at him with surprise. "David, you do not understand the significance of what we have discovered here. This female could be the key to solving reproductive problems that have cost the agricultural industry billions of credits. The research applications alone would justify." "She is not research material," David interrupted with more force than he had intended. "She is a living being who deserves to have her pregnancy proceed without becoming a scientific curiosity." The veterinarian stared at him for a long moment, then glanced back at Kira, who had moved to stand closer to David during their discussion. "You realize that keeping this secret will not be possible indefinitely," she said. "When she gives birth to healthy twins, people are going to notice." David nodded, understanding that they were buying time rather than avoiding the inevitable. How long do we have? If my estimates are correct, about 6 weeks until delivery, Dr. Martinez replied. But David, you need to understand that the moment this becomes public knowledge, your life is going to change dramatically. There will be corporate representatives, government officials, research institutions, and media attention that will make this place feel like the center of the galaxy. As if sensing the weight of their conversation, Kira moved to stand between David and Dr. Martinez, her posture protective despite her normally gentle nature. The "ow" message was clear. She trusted David but was wary of anyone else who might have plans for her future. That evening, after Dr. Martinez had departed with promises to keep the discovery confidential for as long as possible, David sat with Kira in the pasture as the sun set behind the distant mountains. The knowledge of her pregnancy had fundamentally changed their relationship, adding layers of complexity and responsibility that neither of them had anticipated. I know you probably understand more of this than I realize, David said quietly, watching Kira graze in the fading light. But I want you to know that whatever happens, I am going to protect you and your babies. No one is going to take you away from here or treat you like property again. Kira lifted her head and moved to stand beside him, her warm presence providing the same comfort she had offered during his moments of stress over the previous months. But now David sensed something different in their connection, a deeper communication that seemed to convey gratitude, trust, and perhaps even affection. Over the following days, David began making preparations for what he knew would be an increasingly difficult situation. He reinforced the fencing around Kira's pasture, installed additional security systems, and quietly consulted with a lawyer about his rights as Kira's legal owner. The research he conducted into Thornback pregnancy revealed information that both encouraged and worried him. Healthy pregnancies typically proceeded smoothly, but stress during the final weeks of gestation could lead to serious complications for both mother and offspring. The last thing Kira needed was the disruption that would inevitably come when her condition became public knowledge. Meanwhile, Kira's behavior continued to evolve in ways that suggested she understood the significance of her situation. She became more selective about which areas of the farm she would visit, preferring locations that offered good visibility and multiple escape routes. Her appetite increased dramatically, and she began showing the same protective instincts toward David that she exhibited for herself. The breakthrough that would change everything came during the 7th week after the diagnosis, when David woke one morning to find Kira standing at the fence line nearest to the house, her posture alert and focused on something in the distance. Following her gaze, he spotted an unmarked vehicle parked on the access road that led to his property. Even without official confirmation, word was apparently spreading through the agricultural community about the impossible pregnancy happening on David's small farm. The quiet period of preparation was ending, and the real challenges were about to begin. The black sedan had been parked on the ridge overlooking David's farm for 3 days now, its occupants making no effort to hide their surveillance activities. Through his binoculars, David could see them taking photographs and recording video of Kira's daily movements, documenting everything about her routine and the layout of his property. Corporate representatives had started arriving within hours of the first leak about Kira's pregnancy. Despite Dr. Martinez's efforts to maintain confidentiality, someone at the veterinary clinic had clearly shared the information, and now David's quiet farm was becoming the center of unwanted attention from across the agricultural sector. The first official visitor was Robert Chen from Galactic Livestock Solutions, a massive corporation that controlled breeding operations on 17 different worlds. He arrived in an expensive transport with 2 assistants and a briefcase full of legal documents, his smile never quite reaching his eyes as he explained why selling Kira would benefit everyone involved. "Mr. Wells, I understand your attachment to this animal," Chen said, as they stood in David's kitchen, deliberately avoiding looking toward the pasture where Kira was visible. "But you must understand that what you have here represents a scientific breakthrough, worth potentially billions of credits." David poured himself coffee with steady hands, though his stomach was churning with anxiety. "She is not for sale, Mr. Chen. Not at any price." Chen's smile became more strained as he opened his briefcase and withdrew a tablet displaying financial projections. Perhaps you have not fully considered the implications of your situation. Our initial offer of 5 million credits would allow you to purchase this entire region and establish yourself as one of the wealthiest farmers on New Haven. The amount was staggering, more money than David could realistically spend in several lifetimes. It would solve every financial problem he had ever faced and provide security for generations. But when he glanced out the window at Kira grazing peacefully with his other animals, the decision remained clear. The answer is still no, David replied firmly. Kira stays here. Chen's professional demeanor slipped slightly, revealing the calculated businessman underneath. Mr. Wells, I hope you understand that this situation involves more than just your personal preferences. The agricultural community has invested enormous resources in thornback breeding programs, and your animal represents the first successful reproduction in captivity in over a decade. Before David could respond, Chen continued with barely concealed threat in his voice. If you refuse to be reasonable, there are other approaches we can take. Legal challenges to your ownership, government intervention for the greater good, even eminent domain proceedings. If this is classified as a matter of planetary food security, David felt his temper rising but forced himself to remain calm. Are you threatening me, Mr. Chen? I am simply explaining the reality of your situation, Chen replied smoothly. You are a small farmer with limited resources facing potential legal challenges from some of the most powerful corporations in known space. It would be much easier for everyone if we could reach a mutually beneficial agreement. After Chen departed with promises to return with revised offers, David found himself facing a steady stream of visitors. Scientists from various research institutions wanted to study Kira's pregnancy. Government officials expressed concern about proper care for such a valuable asset, and reporters began camping outside his property boundaries, hoping for photographs. The pressure intensified when Dr. Harrison Webb arrived, representing the Reproductive Sciences Institute. Unlike the corporate representatives, Webb approached the situation from a purely scientific perspective that was somehow even more unsettling. Mr. Wells, what you have accomplished here could revolutionize our understanding of thornback biology, Webb explained as he set up monitoring equipment without asking permission. The research applications are extraordinary. We could solve reproductive problems affecting dozens of species across multiple worlds. David watched nervously as Webb's assistants began installing sensors around Kira's pasture. What exactly are you planning to do? Nothing invasive during the pregnancy, Webb assured him. But once the offspring are born, we will need to conduct comprehensive studies of both mother and babies, genetic analysis, behavioral monitoring, reproductive system evaluation, the full range of scientific investigation. The casual way Webb discussed experimenting on Kira and her unborn children made David's blood run cold. You are talking about living beings, not laboratory specimens. Webb looked at him with the patient expression of someone explaining obvious facts to a child. These animals represent potentially billions of credits in agricultural improvements. Their contribution to scientific knowledge could benefit countless other creatures and improve food security across the galaxy. Surely you understand that individual comfort must be weighed against the greater good. That evening, David sat on his porch with Rex beside him, watching Kira settle into her favorite resting spot near the barn. The constant pressure from visitors was clearly affecting her. She had become more cautious about venturing far from secure areas, and her appetite had decreased despite the nutritional demands of her pregnancy. The telepathic connection they shared had grown stronger over recent weeks, allowing David to sense her growing anxiety about the strangers constantly observing her. She understood that these people represented some kind of threat, even if she could not comprehend the specific dangers they posed. David's financial situation was becoming increasingly desperate as his attention focused on protecting Kira rather than managing his failing crops. The harvest season was approaching, but between legal consultations, security measures, and constant interruptions from unwanted visitors, he had been unable to maintain his normal farming schedule. The breaking point came when David discovered surveillance equipment hidden throughout his property. Professional-grade cameras and listening devices had been planted during the night, clearly installed by someone with significant resources and technical expertise. as he dismantled the hidden devices. David realized that his simple plan to protect Kira until her pregnancy concluded was becoming impossible. The corporate and scientific interests circling his farm were not going to accept no for an answer, and their patience was rapidly running out. That night, David made a decision that would change everything, instead of continuing to react to external pressure. He needed to take control of the situation and find a way to protect Kira while addressing the legitimate concerns of the scientific community. The solution came to him as he watched Kira interact with his other animals, demonstrating the intelligence and emotional complexity that her previous owners had never recognized. If he could prove that thornbacks were sapient beings capable of making their own decisions, then Kira's ownership status would become irrelevant. But proving sapience would require documentation that corporate lawyers and government officials would accept. And David was running out of time to gather the evidence he needed before Kira gave birth and the real pressures began. As he developed his plan, David began to understand that saving Kira would require him to challenge fundamental assumptions about the relationship between humans and alien species. He was no longer just fighting for one pregnant animal. He was potentially starting a revolution in how sentient beings were classified and protected throughout the galaxy. The stakes had become higher than he ever imagined, but David was determined to see it through regardless of the personal cost. The birth happened during a thunderstorm that seemed to mirror the chaos surrounding David's farm. Dr. Martinez had been staying in the guest room for the past week, monitoring Kira's condition as her pregnancy reached its final stages. The constant presence of corporate representatives and government officials had made the veterinarian nervous, but she remained committed to ensuring a safe delivery. Kira had chosen the far corner of the barn for her labor, a location that offered privacy while remaining close enough to David's house for easy assistance. Her telepathic distress had woken him hours before dawn, and he had spent the pre-dawn darkness sitting quietly nearby while she worked through the natural process. The first twin emerged as the storm reached its peak intensity, a healthy female with the distinctive scale patterns that indicated strong genetic diversity. The second arrival came 20 minutes later, a male whose size suggested he would grow larger than typical for his species. Both offspring were alert and responsive within minutes of birth, demonstrating the robust health that characterized successful thornback reproduction. "Absolutely remarkable," Dr. Martinez whispered, as she completed her initial examination of the newborns. "Perfect development, excellent reflexes, and both are showing early signs of the intelligence markers we associate with healthy thornbacks." David felt a mixture of joy and dread as he watched Kira gently clean her babies. The successful birth would intensify external pressure exponentially, transforming speculation about her reproductive capabilities into documented proof that would make her even more valuable to corporate interests. The peaceful moment lasted exactly 43 minutes before the first vehicles began arriving. Despite David's efforts to keep the birth private, someone had been monitoring the farm closely enough to detect the change in activity. Corporate representatives who had been waiting in nearby hotels for weeks suddenly appeared with legal documents and transport equipment. Robert Chen returned with a larger entourage and significantly more aggressive tactics. "Mr. Wells, the birth of healthy twins changes everything," he announced as his assistants began setting up monitoring equipment without permission. "You now possess the only successful breeding pair in captivity, making this a matter of galactic agricultural security." Behind Chen came Dr. Webb with a BD team of researchers carrying equipment that looked more suitable for a laboratory than a barn. "We need to begin comprehensive testing immediately," Webb declared. "The first few weeks of development are crucial for understanding the biological factors that enabled this reproduction." David positioned himself between the scientists and Kira's corner of the barn. "Everyone needs to leave immediately. The mother and babies need quiet time to bond without interference." "I'm afraid that is not possible," Chen replied, producing a tablet with official-looking documents. "We have obtained preliminary injunctions that require this breeding group to be placed under scientific supervision. Your ownership rights are being challenged on grounds of planetary security." The legal papers Chen displayed were complex and intimidating, filled with technical language about genetic resources and agricultural protection acts. David understood enough to realize that powerful forces were moving to strip away his legal rights and claim Kira. and her offspring as government assets, Dr. Martinez stepped forward, her professional authority lending weight to her words. These animals need at least 72 hours of undisturbed bonding time. Any interference during this critical period could compromise the health of both mother and offspring. Webb dismissed her concerns with an impatient gesture. We have facilities specifically designed for monitoring newborn thornbacks. Our equipment will provide better care than this primitive barn, while allowing us to gather essential research data. As the argument escalated around them, David became aware that Kira was following the discussion with obvious anxiety. Her telepathic projections carried waves of fear and confusion as she sensed the threat these strangers represented to her children. The newborns had moved closer to their mother, instinctively responding to her distress. The confrontation reached a breaking point when Webb's assistants attempted to approach Kira's resting area with scanning equipment. The thornback female rose to her feet with surprising speed for someone who had given birth hours earlier, positioning herself protectively over her offspring while projecting unmistakable hostility toward the researchers. "Back away immediately," David commanded, recognizing signs of maternal aggression that could become dangerous if the situation escalated further. "She will defend her babies if she feels threatened." Webb ignored the warning and continued advancing with his scanner, apparently convinced that Kira was merely livestock that could be managed through intimidation. His mistake became clear when she unleashed a telepathic projection of pure maternal fury that hit everyone in the barn like a physical blow. The humans staggered backward under the assault of alien emotion, experiencing secondhand the primal desperation of a mother protecting her young. Only David remained steady, his months of bonding with Kira having prepared him for the intensity of her telepathic abilities. Did everyone feel that? Dr. Martinez asked shakily, staring at Kira with new understanding. That was not just animal instinct. That was conscious communication. The demonstration of Kira's telepathic capabilities provided David with the opportunity he had been waiting for. "She is sapient," he announced to the stunned group. "Kira is not livestock or property. She is an intelligent being capable of making her own decisions about her future." Chen recovered quickly from the telepathic shock, his corporate training. Overriding personal discomfort, emotional projection does not constitute legal sapience, he argued. Many non-sapient species demonstrate protective behaviors. But David had spent weeks preparing for this moment, documenting every instance of Kira's problem-solving abilities, her tool use, her apparent understanding of complex concepts, and her deliberate communication attempts. The evidence was circumstantial, but compelling, when viewed as a complete picture. "We need formal sapience testing," Dr. Martinez said, her scientific curiosity overcoming her medical concerns. If thornbacks are indeed sapient, it would explain why traditional breeding programs have failed. They have been treating intelligent beings like animals. Webb objected strenuously to any delay in his research schedule, while Chen began making calls to corporate lawyers about the legal implications of potential sapience classification. The barn became a chaos of competing voices and conflicting agendas, while Kira watched over her babies with growing agitation. Finally, David made the decision that would determine everything. That followed walking slowly to Kira's corner of the barn. He knelt down at a respectful distance and spoke directly to her while projecting his own emotional state as clearly as possible. "Kira, these people want to take you and your children away for testing and breeding," he said quietly. "I can try to protect you, but ultimately the choice has to be yours. Do you want to stay here with me or do you want to go with them?" What happened next would be talked about for generations across the agricultural worlds. Kira approached David slowly, then gently pressed her forehead against his shoulder in a gesture that conveyed trust, gratitude, and determination. Her telepathic response carried a single, unmistakable message. She was choosing to stay with the human who had treated her as family rather than property. But her message also contained something else that took David's breath away. She was not just choosing for herself, but consciously, deciding the future for her offspring based on her evaluation of what would provide them with the best possible lives. The implications of that decision would reshape everything that followed. 2 years had passed since the night when Kira's telepathic communication changed everything, and the transformation of David's small farm exceeded anything he could have imagined. What had begun as a desperate attempt to protect one pregnant alien had evolved into a revolutionary approach to interspecies cooperation that was being studied and replicated across dozens of worlds. The formal sapience testing had taken 6 months to complete, involving teams of linguists, cognitive scientists, and xenobiologists who documented Kira's problem-solving abilities, emotional intelligence, and capacity for abstract thought. The results were unambiguous. Thornbacks possessed intelligence comparable to many recognized sapient species, making their treatment as livestock a historical injustice of staggering proportions. David stood on the porch of his expanded farmhouse, watching Kira's twins, now named Hope and Freedom at their mother's apparent preference, playing in the pasture, with a group of young thornbacks who had been rescued from breeding facilities across the agricultural sector. The sight of healthy, happy aliens choosing to remain on his farm still amazed him. Dr. Martinez approached from the direction of the new research building, carrying reports from the latest psychological evaluations. The behavioral assessments continue to show remarkable progress, she said, settling into a chair beside David. Every thornback we have brought here has demonstrated increased intelligence and emotional stability within weeks of arrival. The success of David's approach had attracted attention from xenologists and ethicists throughout known space. His discovery, that thornback intelligence flourished in environments based on partnership rather than ownership, had forced a complete reevaluation of agricultural practices involving potentially sapient species. Kira emerged from the barn with several other adult thornbacks, her posture showing the confidence and contentment that had replaced her earlier fearfulness. She had become the unofficial leader of the growing community, using her telepathic abilities to help newly arrived individuals adjust to their freedom and dignity. The Galactic Ethics Council has approved our proposal, Dr. Martinez continued, reviewing her tablet. The Wells Kira Foundation will receive official recognition as the first interspecies cooperative in agricultural history, along with the funding necessary to expand operations to other worlds. David nodded, though part of him still felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had accomplished. What had started as a simple act of compassion toward one mistreated animal had become a movement that was reshaping relationships between humans and alien species across the galaxy. The Foundation's model was elegantly simple. Instead of owning alien animals, farmers could enter into partnership agreements with sapient species who chose to contribute their labor and biological products in exchange for security, respect, and a share of the profits. The arrangement benefited everyone involved while acknowledging the fundamental rights of intelligent beings. Corporate resistance had been fierce initially, with companies like Galactic Livestock Solutions claiming that recognizing animal sapience would destroy the agricultural economy. But the productivity improvements demonstrated on David's farm had quickly converted skeptics into believers. Happy and respected aliens worked harder and produced better results than stressed and exploited ones. Robert Chen had eventually become one of the Foundation's most vocal supporters after witnessing the transformation in his own breeding facilities. We were solving the wrong problem for decades, he admitted during a recent visit. Instead of trying to force reproduction through technology and chemistry, we should have been creating environments where intelligent beings wanted to raise families. The breakthrough in thornback reproduction had indeed revolutionized agriculture, but not in the way anyone had originally anticipated. Rather than developing new breeding techniques, farmers learned to provide the emotional security and social structures that allowed natural reproductive behaviors to flourish. Dr. Webb's research had taken an entirely different direction once thornback sapience was confirmed. Instead of studying them as biological specimens, he now worked with Kira and her community to understand their culture, communication methods, and technological capabilities. The results suggested that humans had barely scratched the surface of what these remarkable beings could accomplish when treated as equals. Hope and Freedom had grown into healthy adolescents who demonstrated intelligence that exceeded even their mother's remarkable abilities. They served as ambassadors for their species, communicating with human children and helping to establish educational programs that taught respect for all forms of consciousness. The financial success of the Foundation had allowed David to expand his operations far beyond anything he had originally envisioned. But more importantly, it had provided him with the resources to rescue animals from inadequate facilities throughout the sector, giving them the opportunity to discover their own potential in an environment of genuine partnership. As evening approached, David walked through the pastures where dozens of different species grazed together in peaceful cooperation. Many of these aliens had been considered worthless or problematic by their previous owners, only to reveal extraordinary capabilities once they were treated with appropriate respect. Kira approached as he completed his evening rounds, her telepathic greeting carrying the warmth and affection that had deepened over their years together. She no longer needed his protection, but their bond remained strong as they worked together to build something unprecedented in galactic history. "Any regrets?" David asked, knowing she would understand the question through their shared emotional connection. Kira's response came as a complex mixture of contentment, pride, and anticipation for the future. She had found her purpose in helping other members of her species discover their own potential, and she looked forward to the day when partnership rather than ownership would be the standard relationship between humans and alien intelligences. The success of their experiment was already spreading to other worlds, with similar foundations being established wherever humans encountered potentially sapient species. The agricultural revolution they had started would eventually transform how consciousness itself was recognized and protected throughout the galaxy. As they stood together, watching the sun set over their peaceful community, David reflected on how a simple act of kindness toward one mistreated alien had grown into something that would benefit countless beings for generations to come. Sometimes the most profound changes began with the smallest gestures of compassion. The Foundation's motto, inscribed above the entrance to their main building, captured the essence of what they had accomplished. Every conscious being deserves the chance to choose their own destiny. It was a principle that Kira had taught David through her own courage and determination, and one that would guide their work for years to come in the distance. Hope and freedom were teaching a group of human children how to communicate with newly arrived aliens, building bridges between species that would ensure the partnership model continued to grow and evolve. The future they were creating together looked brighter than anything David had dared to imagine when he first placed that modest bid at a livestock auction that seemed like a lifetime ago.